I woke up to the sound of my alarm at 6 in the morning, rolled over to silence it, and immediately knew something was wrong when I looked out my bedroom window. My black Ford F-250 was gone from its spot in front of my townhouse. Just gone. In its place was nothing but 3 feet of fresh snow from the blizzard that had hammered Denver overnight. My name is Steven Ashford, and I'm a district court judge here in Denver, Colorado. I've lived in the Meadowbrook Hills townhouse community for 8 years now, ever since my divorce was finalized. It's a decent place, relatively quiet, with reasonable HOA fees and what I thought were sensible rules. I'd never had any issues with the homeowners association before. I kept my lawn maintained, painted my trim the approved beige color, and generally stayed out of everyone's business. That morning, standing in my pajamas staring at the empty space where my truck should have been, I felt my blood pressure rising in a way that rarely happened even in my courtroom. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the weather alerts. Sure enough, Denver had issued a parking ban starting at midnight due to the blizzard conditions. I vaguely remembered seeing something about it on the news the previous evening, but I'd been buried in case files until nearly 11 and had fallen asleep on my couch. I'd stumbled to bed around 11:30, completely missing any chance to move my truck before the ban took effect. But here's the thing about emergency parking bans in Denver. They're city-wide ordinances enforced by the city, not by HOAs. The city would post notices, send alerts, and if they towed your vehicle, it would go to an official city impound lot. I'd signed enough warrants and reviewed enough cases to know the procedure inside and out. I threw on jeans and a sweater and trudged outside in my boots, the snow immediately soaking through to my socks because I hadn't bothered with proper snow gear. The cold bit at my face as I examined the spot where my truck had been. There were tire tracks, clear impressions of a tow truck's wheels, and drag marks where my F-250 had been pulled onto a flatbed. But there was something else too. A bright orange sticker attached to my front door that I'd somehow missed in my initial panic. The sticker read, "Vehicle towed for violation of Meadowbrook Hills HOA emergency parking regulations, Section 14.3 of the HOA Covenant. To retrieve your vehicle, contact Brenda Morrison at 303-555-0147. Storage fees accrue at $50 per day." I stood there reading it 3 times, the wind whipping snow into my face, trying to process what I was seeing. The HOA had towed my truck, not the city, the HOA. And they were charging storage fees. I pulled out my phone with numb fingers and dialed the number. It rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, dripping with satisfaction. Meadowbrook Hills HOA, Brenda Morrison speaking. "This is Steven Ashford from Unit 42. You towed my truck." "Mr. Ashford, yes, I have your file right here. Your vehicle was in violation of our emergency parking ban. As HOA president, I authorized the removal at 2:15 this morning." "Brenda, the city issues parking bans, not the HOA. You can't just tow people's vehicles." "Actually, Mr. Ashford, if you'd read your covenant agreements when you purchased your property, you'd know that Section 14.3 explicitly grants the HOA authority to remove vehicles during emergency situations. The blizzard constituted an emergency. Our snow removal contractors needed clear access to all streets and parking areas. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Where is my truck?" "It's being stored at Mile High Towing on Brighton Boulevard. You can retrieve it once you've paid the towing fee of $350 and the storage fee. Since it's been less than 24 hours, that's only $50. You'll also need to pay a $50 administrative processing fee to the HOA. $450 total." That's correct. And Mr. Ashford, I should mention that we have documentation of 3 previous minor violations at your property. Trash cans left out past 7 p.m. on 2 occasions, and once your grass exceeded the 4-inch height limit. This towing incident will be added to your file. 4 violations within a calendar year can result in escalating fines or even legal action. The way she said it, with that smug tone, like she was enjoying every second of this, made something snap inside me. But I kept my voice level. I'll be by to discuss this in person. When are HOA office hours? I'm working from home today due to the snow, Mr. Ashford. You can pay the fees online through our portal, and I'll email you a release form for the towing company. I prefer to discuss this in person. That's really not necessary. Everything can be handled electronically. I'll be at your house in an hour, Brenda. What's your address? There was a pause. Excuse me, you're working from home, conducting HOA business. That makes your home the HOA office for the day. I have a right to meet with HOA leadership to discuss violations and fees. What's your address? Another pause, longer this time. Fine, I'm at Unit 12, but make it 2 hours. I need to shovel my driveway. See you then. I hung up before she could respond and immediately went back inside. My townhouse was cold, the furnace struggling to keep up with the dropping temperatures outside. I made coffee, strong and black, and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop. The first thing I did was pull up the Meadowbrook Hills HOA covenant agreements. I had digital copies from when I bought the place, though I'd be the first to admit I hadn't read them thoroughly in years. I scrolled through to section 14.3. It was there, just as Brenda had said. The HOA board reserves the right to remove vehicles from common areas and streets during emergency situations that require immediate access for maintenance, repair, or safety purposes. Vehicle owners will be responsible for all towing and storage fees. But as I read further, I noticed something interesting. The section required written notice to all residents at least 24 hours before any planned emergency action, except in cases of immediate danger to life or property. And even then, the HOA was required to make reasonable attempts to contact vehicle owners before authorizing removal. I checked my phone. No calls, no texts, no emails. I checked my mailbox through the window, saw it was empty except for the orange sticker situation. No written notice had been provided. Then I did what I always do when something doesn't smell right. I started digging into the details. I pulled up the Meadowbrook Hills HOA website and navigated to the board member section. Brenda Morrison, President. Gary Hutchins, Vice President. Linda Carmichael, Treasurer. 2 other names I didn't recognize as board members. I clicked on the meeting minutes section. The most recent entry was from 2 weeks ago. I downloaded the PDF and started reading. Buried in the middle of 3 pages of tedious discussion about landscaping contracts and mailbox repairs was a single paragraph about emergency vehicle removal protocols. Board unanimously approved motion to contract with Mile High Towing for emergency vehicle removal services. Board President Morrison authorized to execute contract and implement protocols as needed. Fee structure. HOA receives 20% of all towing fees as administrative compensation. I read that last sentence 3 times. The HOA was getting a kickback from the towing company. 20% of every towing fee, which meant they were getting $70 from my $450 bill. Multiply that by however many vehicles they'd towed during the blizzard, and this was starting to look like a profit center rather than an emergency protocol. I opened a new browser tab and searched for Mile High Towing. The company had a basic website with a Denver address and phone number, but something about it felt off. The design was amateur, the kind of thing someone could throw together in an afternoon. There were no reviews, no presence on social media, nothing to indicate this was an established business. Then I searched for the business registration through the Colorado Secretary of State's office. Mile High Towing LLC, registered 6 months ago. Registered agent, Gary Hutchins. The same Gary Hutchins who was vice president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. I sat back in my chair, coffee going cold in my hand. This wasn't just an overzealous HOA president enforcing parking rules. This was a scheme. They'd created a towing company, contracted with themselves, and were now using HOA authority to generate revenue through their own company. As a judge, I'd seen a lot of small-time fraud over the years. People always thought they were being clever, finding loopholes, operating in gray areas where no one would notice. But this was particularly brazen because it was being done in plain sight, buried in HOA meeting minutes that most residents probably never read. I needed more information before I confronted Brenda. I called the courthouse and reached my clerk, Maria. "Judge Ashford, are you okay? The news said the blizzard dumped 3 feet. "I'm fine, Maria. Listen, I need you to pull some information for me when you get a chance. It's not urgent, but I'd like it by end of day." "Of course. What do you need?" "Search for any business permits, operating licenses, or applications that have come across my desk for approval in the past year related to a company called Mile High Towing LLC. Also check for any permits related to the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. Is everything all right? Just following up on something." "Thanks, Maria." I hung up and glanced at the clock. Still an hour before I needed to head over to Brenda's place. I spent the time reviewing more HOA documents, including the financial statements from the past year. The line items were vague, using terms like administrative services and community maintenance. But there was a clear uptick in revenue over the past 6 months that didn't correlate with any increase in HOA dues. At 9:45, I bundled up properly this time with a real winter coat and waterproof boots and headed out. The snow was still falling, though not as heavily as during the night. The streets inside the townhouse community hadn't been plowed yet, which was ironic given that the supposed reason for towing vehicles was to clear streets for snow removal. I trudged through the snow to Unit 12, which was at the end of a cul-de-sac. Brenda's driveway had been recently shoveled, and I could see her watching me through the front window as I approached. She opened the door before I could knock. Brenda Morrison looked exactly like I'd expected. Early 50s, blonde hair with highlights, wearing yoga pants and a fleece jacket with the Meadowbrook Hills HOA logo embroidered on it. Her smile was tight and didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Ashford, please come in. Wipe your boots." I did as instructed and followed her into a living room that looked like it had been staged for a home design magazine. Everything was white and beige and carefully arranged. She gestured to a chair, but I remained standing. "I've reviewed Section 14.3 of the Covenant," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "There's no record of any written notice about a parking ban, and I received no calls or messages before my vehicle was towed. The Weather Service issued the blizzard warning, Mr. Ashford. That constitutes notice. And as for attempting to contact you, we called the phone number on file." "Which number?" She pulled out her phone and showed me. It was my old number from before I'd switched carriers 3 years ago. "When did I provide that number?" "When you purchased your property 8 years ago." "And have you attempted to update contact information for residents since then?" Her smile faltered slightly. "Residents are responsible for updating their own information through the HOA portal. A portal that I wasn't aware existed until I looked at the website this morning." When was the last time the HOA sent out communication reminding residents to update their contact information? That's not the point, Mr. Ashford. The point is that you violated parking rules during an emergency situation. Your vehicle was removed in accordance with HOA policy. Policy that allows the HOA to collect 20% of towing fees from a company owned by the HOA vice president. The color drained from her face. I don't know what you're talking about. Mile High Towing LLC. Registered agent Gary Hutchins. The same Gary Hutchins who sits on the HOA board. The same company that the HOA contracted with for emergency towing services with a built-in kickback structure. That Mile High Towing. Brenda's expression hardened. The board acted entirely within its authority. All decisions were made in accordance with HOA bylaws and Colorado state law. Which Colorado state law specifically? I'm not a lawyer, Mr. Ashford. No, but I am. Well, technically I'm a judge, district court to be precise, which means I have a pretty good understanding of what's legal and what isn't. She blinked. You're a judge for 12 years now. And here's something interesting about being a district court judge in Denver. I review and sign off on various permits and licenses. Business permits, for example. Operating permits for towing companies. Special permits for HOAs that want to exercise authority beyond their standard scope. I watched her processing this information, seeing the moment when it clicked. Did the HOA apply for any such permits, Brenda? We followed the proper procedures. Because here's the thing. Colorado law does allow HOAs to contract with towing companies, but there are strict regulations about how it works. The HOA has to be properly registered with the county, which Meadowbrook Hills is. But when an HOA wants to enforce parking restrictions beyond what's in the covenant, especially when those restrictions involve vehicle removal and fees, they need approval from the county board. And for commercial towing operations, there's a whole additional layer of permits and insurance requirements. We have insurance, Brenda said weakly. Does Mile High Towing have the proper commercial towing license issued by the Colorado Public Utilities Commission? Because that's required for any company that tows vehicles at the request of a private entity like an HOA. Silence. I'll take that as a no. Do you know what the penalties are for operating an unlicensed towing company in Colorado, or for an HOA collecting fees through unauthorized channels? This is harassment, Brenda said, her voice rising. You're trying to intimidate me because you don't want to pay a legitimate fee. I'm trying to understand why my vehicle was illegally towed by an unlicensed company operating a scheme to defraud residents. How many other people did you tow last night? 15 vehicles. All of them were in violation. So 15 people at $450 each. That's $6,750 in fees, which means the HOA collected $1,350 in kickbacks in a single night. How many other emergency situations have you manufactured in the past 6 months to justify towing vehicles? Get out of my house. I'll be leaving momentarily. But first, I want you to know that I'm going to file a formal complaint with the HOA board, with the county, and with the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. I'm also going to make sure every resident in this community knows exactly what's been happening. And Brenda, if you've spent any of that kickback money on anything other than legitimate HOA expenses, that's embezzlement. That's a criminal offense. You can't prove anything, she said, but her voice was shaking now. I'm a judge. I know exactly what I can prove and what I can't. You documented everything in your own meeting minutes. You registered the business in Gary's name but operated it under HOA authority. You created a paper trail that's going to be very easy to follow. I turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing. I want a full refund of all fees related to my vehicle, and I want my truck released immediately, no charge. If that doesn't happen by noon today, I'll start making official inquiries before the end of the business day." "That's extortion," Brenda sputtered. "No, that's me giving you an opportunity to start making this right before it becomes a criminal matter." "Noon, Brenda." I left her standing in her perfect living room and walked back through the snow to my townhouse. My phone rang before I'd even made it halfway. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Steven Ashford." "Mr. Ashford, this is Gary Hutchins. I'm vice president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. Brenda just called me. I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, Gary. I understand perfectly. You created a towing company, contracted with the HOA you help run, and you're using emergency situations to generate revenue. That's fraud." "Now hold on. The board approved everything. We're allowed to contract with whatever companies we choose for services. You're not allowed to contract with yourselves without disclosure and resident approval. You're not allowed to operate an unlicensed towing company. And you're definitely not allowed to collect kickbacks that aren't clearly documented as revenue to the HOA with proper accounting. Those fees are documented as vague line items that don't specify their source. When's the last time you provided residents with a detailed financial breakdown showing revenue from towing operations?" Silence on the other end. "That's what I thought. Here's what's going to happen, Gary. You're going to release my vehicle immediately, no charge. You're going to refund every single person you towed last night, and then you're going to dissolve Mile High Towing and resign from the HOA board. Or what? Or I make some phone calls. First to the district attorney's office, because I golf with Tom Brennan every other weekend, and he loves cases involving white-collar fraud. Second to the Denver Post, because they're always looking for good local corruption stories. Third to every resident in this community, because they have a right to know what their HOA leadership has been doing. You're bluffing. Try me." I hung up and went inside. I was cold, tired, and angry, but I also felt something else, that particular satisfaction that comes from cornering someone who thought they were above consequences. My phone rang again. "Maria from the courthouse. Judge, I found what you were looking for. There was a business permit application for Mile High Towing that came across your desk 7 months ago. And you denied it. The application was incomplete, missing insurance documentation and proper licensing from the PUC. You sent it back with notes about the deficiencies. Did they ever resubmit? No record of it. As far as I can tell, they're operating without the permit you required. Thanks, Maria. Can you send me copies of everything already in your email?" I pulled up my email and found the files. Sure enough, there was my signature on the denial letter, dated 7 months ago. The application had been submitted by Gary Hutchins for Mile High Towing LLC, requesting a business permit to operate a commercial towing service within Denver city limits. I denied it because the application was sloppy and incomplete, missing half the required documentation, which meant Gary and Brenda knew they needed the permit. They'd applied for it, been denied, and then decided to operate anyway, probably figuring no one would notice or care. They hadn't counted on towing the judge who denied their permit. I spent the next hour drafting a formal letter of complaint to the HOA board, detailing everything I'd discovered. I kept it factual, citing specific sections of Colorado law and HOA regulations, attaching copies of the business registration, the permit denial, and excerpts from the HOA meeting minutes. I also drafted a separate letter to the Colorado Public Utilities Commission reporting an unlicensed towing operation. At 11:30, My phone rang. "Brenda, your truck is being released. No charge for anything. The towing company will call you within the hour with details." "And the other 14 vehicles being processed? I want confirmation in writing that everyone's been refunded." "Fine. You'll have it by end of day. And Gary's resignation from the board. That's between Gary and the board." "Not good enough, Brenda. Both of you need to resign. Today." "You can't force us to resign." "No, but I can make your lives very difficult if you don't. And I can certainly make sure the next HOA election includes full disclosure about mile-high towing and the kickback scheme. Let the residents decide if they want you in leadership." Another long pause. "We'll discuss it at an emergency board meeting. You have until 5 p.m. today. After that, my complaint letters get sent to the DA and the PUC." I hung up and waited. My truck was delivered back to my townhouse at 1:15 p.m., dropped off by a sheepish-looking tow truck driver who couldn't make eye contact. I inspected it carefully, found no damage, and sent him on his way without a word. At 2 p.m., I received an email from Brenda with a spreadsheet showing all 15 towed vehicles and confirmation that full refunds had been processed. The email was terse, just the spreadsheet and a single line. "As requested." At 4:30 p.m., I received another email, this time from Gary. "Brenda Morrison and I are resigning from the HOA board effective immediately. A special election will be held next month to fill our positions." I sat back in my chair, reading the email twice. Part of me felt satisfied. They were facing consequences for their actions, and the residents of Meadowbrook Hills would be better off without corrupt leadership. But another part of me, the judge part, knew this wasn't really over. Resignation wasn't the same as accountability. They'd still committed fraud. They'd still operated an unlicensed business. They'd still collected money under false pretenses. I opened my complaint letters and added Gary's resignation email as an attachment, then sent everything to the district attorney's office and the PUC. Whatever happened next would be out of my hands, but at least I'd done my due diligence. The following week, I received a call from Tom Brennan, the district attorney. "Steve, got your complaint about the HOA situation. This is wild, worth pursuing, potentially. The dollar amounts are relatively small, which makes it borderline for criminal prosecution, but the pattern of behavior is concerning. Creating a shell company to defraud residents, operating without proper licensing, falsifying emergency situations to generate revenue. It's the kind of thing that sets a bad precedent if we don't address it. What are you thinking? I'd like to interview some of the other residents who were towed, see if there's a pattern of this happening. If we can establish that Morrison and Hutchins were systematically manufacturing emergencies to justify towing vehicles, that strengthens the case significantly. I can provide you with a list of everyone who was towed during the blizzard. The HOA sent me a spreadsheet with contact information." "Perfect. Send that over. I'll also need you to come in for a formal statement at some point, though I know that's awkward given your position." "I'm a witness and a victim in this case, Tom. I'll recuse myself from anything that comes to my courtroom, obviously, but I'm happy to provide whatever information you need." Over the next 2 weeks, the story spread through Meadowbrook Hills like wildfire. I hadn't said anything publicly, but apparently several of the other residents who'd been towed had compared notes and realized something was off. Someone posted about it on the community Facebook page, and suddenly, everyone was talking about the HOA's towing scheme. An emergency residents meeting was called for a Saturday afternoon at the community clubhouse. I wasn't planning to attend, but several neighbors knocked on my door asking me to come and explain what I'd discovered. The clubhouse was packed. Every chair was filled, with people standing along the walls and in the doorway. The remaining 3 board members sat at a table in the front, looking overwhelmed. Linda Carmichael, the treasurer, stood up to address the crowd. "Thank you all for coming. As you know, we've had some concerns raised about the HOA's towing practices. Brenda Morrison and Gary Hutchins have resigned, and we're conducting a full review of all financial transactions from the past year. We want to know what happened," someone shouted from the back. "Who's going to pay us back for all the bogus fines and fees? All towing fees from the recent blizzard have been refunded," Linda said. "We're reviewing other potential violations and will address them on a case-by-case basis." "That's not good enough," another voice called out. "We want to know how much money they stole. We're still calculating that. Once we have complete information, we'll share it with all residents." "Is it true that Judge Ashford exposed the whole thing?" someone asked. Heads turned toward me. I hadn't wanted to be the center of attention, but it seemed unavoidable now. "I discovered some irregularities," I said carefully. "I reported them to the appropriate authorities. The district attorney's office is investigating." "Can you tell us what you found?" I hesitated. As a judge, I was used to being in a position of authority, making rulings, explaining legal concepts. But this felt different. These were my neighbors, people I saw at the mailbox or the gym. I didn't want to be the HOA vigilante, but they deserved to know the truth. The HOA board, specifically Brenda Morrison and Gary Hutchins, created a towing company called Mile High Towing, I said. They contracted with that company using HOA funds, which by itself isn't necessarily illegal. But the company wasn't properly licensed, and the contract included a provision where the HOA received 20% of all towing fees. Essentially, they were using their authority as HOA board members to generate revenue for themselves. "How much money are we talking about?" someone asked. "Based on the financial records I've reviewed, probably somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 over the past 6 months. The room erupted. People were shouting, demanding answers, asking how this could have happened. Linda tried to regain control, but it was chaos. Finally, one of the other board members, a man named Richard Torres, stood up and raised his hands for quiet. "I want to be very clear about something," Richard said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I was not aware of the arrangement between Brenda, Gary, and Mile High Towing. I reviewed the meeting minutes where this was supposedly approved, and I don't remember voting on it. In fact, I pulled my personal notes from that meeting, and there's no record of us discussing a kickback provision. I think Brenda added that language after the fact." "That's fraud," someone shouted. "Yes, it probably is, which is why we've turned over all financial records and meeting minutes to the district attorney's office. Linda and I want justice as much as you do." The meeting continued for another hour, with residents asking questions and the remaining board members promising transparency and accountability. By the end, a vote was taken to hire an independent auditor to review all HOA finances for the past 5 years and to implement new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. I left feeling exhausted but hopeful. The community was taking action. People were engaged and demanding better leadership. 2 months later, Tom Brennan called me again. "We're moving forward with charges against Morrison and Hutchins. Multiple counts of theft, fraud, and operating a business without proper licensing. Probably looking at plea deals given the dollar amounts, but they'll have criminal records and significant fines." "What about restitution for the residents?" "That'll be part of the plea agreement. Full restitution plus penalties." "Good. Steve, I have to ask. When you towed Gary's application for the business permit 7 months ago, did you have any idea this would happen?" "No. It was just a bad application. Incomplete documentation, missing insurance, wrong forms. I deny a dozen applications a month for similar reasons. But if you hadn't denied it, if they'd gotten the permit, they could have operated legally. Maybe. But the kickback arrangement would still have been problematic. And the fact that they moved forward without the permit tells me they knew what they were doing was wrong. They just didn't care. Fair point. Thanks for your help on this. The case moved slowly through the system, as these things always do. Brenda and Gary both hired lawyers, tried to argue that everything had been properly approved by the board, that they'd just made administrative errors. But the evidence was overwhelming. The board members testified that they'd never approved a kickback arrangement. The residents who'd been towed testified about receiving no notice before their vehicles were removed. The financial records showed money flowing from mile-high towing to accounts controlled by Brenda and Gary. 5 months after that blizzard morning when I woke up to find my truck gone, I sat in a courtroom, not my own, and watched as Brenda Morrison and Gary Hutchins pleaded guilty to theft and fraud charges. They each received 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, and were ordered to pay full restitution to all Meadowbrook Hills residents who'd been affected by their scheme. The judge, my colleague Rebecca Chan, was thorough in her remarks. "The court takes these charges seriously," she said. "While the dollar amounts involved may seem relatively small in the scope of criminal cases, the betrayal of trust is significant. Homeowners associations exist to serve their communities, not to enrich their leadership. You abused your positions, created a fraudulent scheme, and attempted to hide your actions behind bureaucratic language and complex fee structures. This court will not tolerate such behavior." Brenda and Gary both stood silent, accepting their sentences. Brenda's husband sat in the gallery, looking devastated. Gary was alone. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but it all felt so unnecessary. If they'd just followed the rules, applied for the proper permits, operated honestly, none of this would have happened. They destroyed their reputations and created criminal records over what amounted to a few $1,000s each. The following week, Meadowbrook Hills held a special election for new HOA board members. I didn't run, had no interest in the politics of it, but I did vote for candidates who seemed committed to transparency and accountability. The community had learned a hard lesson about paying attention to HOA governance, and there was a renewed energy around civic participation. My neighbor across the street, an accountant named Patricia, knocked on my door one evening with a bottle of wine. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for standing up to them. A lot of us were intimidated by Brenda. She had a way of making you feel like you were the problem if you questioned anything." "I just got lucky being in a position where I could push back," I said. "No, you did more than push back. You could have just paid the fees, gotten your truck back, and moved on. Instead, you held them accountable. That matters." We sat on my porch, drinking wine and watching the sunset. The snow from that blizzard was long gone, replaced by the first hints of spring. The streets were clear. The common areas were maintained by a new, properly licensed contractor, and the HOA was functioning the way it was supposed to. "Did you ever wonder why they targeted you specifically?" Patricia asked. "I mean, they towed 15 vehicles, but yours seems to have been the one that broke everything open." "Pure chance," I said. "I happen to be the one person in the community with enough legal knowledge and professional authority to recognize what was happening and do something about it." "Do you think they knew who you were? That you were the judge who denied their permit?" I'd thought about that question myself. "I don't think so. My professional life and my personal life are pretty separate. I don't advertise what I do for a living. I think they genuinely had no idea that they were towing the truck of the same judge who'd flagged their business application as deficient. The universe has a sense of irony, Patricia said with a laugh, that it does. The independent audit of HOA finances was completed 3 months later. It revealed that Brenda and Gary's scheme had actually been going on longer than anyone realized. They'd been using various tactics to generate unauthorized revenue for over 2 years, with the towing operation just being the latest and most brazen. In total, they'd collected nearly $35,000 in bogus fees, fines, and kickbacks. The audit findings led to additional civil suits from residents seeking damages beyond the criminal restitution. The last I heard, both Brenda and Gary had declared bankruptcy and moved out of the Denver area entirely. As for Meadowbrook Hills, the community emerged from the scandal stronger and more united. New bylaws were implemented requiring detailed financial reporting, mandatory audits, and term limits for board members. Residents actually started attending monthly meetings, asking questions, holding leadership accountable. I continued my normal life, going to work at the courthouse, coming home to my quiet townhouse, maintaining the intentional separation between Judge Ashford and Steve the neighbor. But occasionally, someone would recognize me at the grocery store or the coffee shop and thank me for what I'd done. It was uncomfortable at first, but I came to appreciate that sometimes doing the right thing means stepping outside your comfort zone. One afternoon, about a year after the whole incident, I was in my chambers reviewing case files when my clerk Maria knocked on the door. "Judge, there's a business permit application that just came across your desk. I thought you'd want to see it personally." She handed me the file. It was for a new towing company. This one properly filled out with all the required documentation, insurance certificates, and licensing from the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. The applicant was someone I didn't recognize, but the business address was in Denver. I reviewed every page carefully, checking each requirement against the regulations. Everything was in order. The application was complete, professional, and legitimate. I signed the approval and handed it back to Maria. "This is how it's supposed to work," I said. "Follow the rules, do the paperwork, operate honestly. It's not complicated." "You'd think more people would figure that out," Maria said with a smile. "You'd think." That evening, I drove home through familiar streets, parked my truck in front of my townhouse in the spot that had been empty that snowy morning so many months ago, and walked inside. The HOA newsletter was in my mailbox, actually readable now, with detailed financial reports and meeting minutes that made sense. I made dinner, poured a glass of wine, and sat on my porch watching the neighborhood. Kids played in the common area. Neighbors walked their dogs. Someone was grilling in their backyard, the smell of charcoal and cooking meat drifting through the evening air. It was ordinary and peaceful, exactly what a community should be. No drama, no schemes, no one abusing their authority for personal gain. Just people living their lives, governed by reasonable rules enforced fairly. My phone buzzed with an email from the courthouse. Another day of cases tomorrow, another round of decisions to make, another opportunity to apply the law as written and ensure justice was served. I thought about Brenda and Gary, wherever they were now, hopefully learning from their mistakes. I thought about the residents of Meadowbrook Hills who'd been brave enough to demand accountability. I thought about the random chance that had led to my truck being the one that exposed everything. The improbable coincidence that the person they chose to tow happened to be the judge with the knowledge and authority to unravel their entire operation. The universe does have a sense of irony. But more than that, It has a way of ensuring that eventually, inevitably, people face consequences for their actions. You can hide behind bureaucracy and fine print and positions of petty authority, but eventually someone will look close enough, care enough, know enough to hold you accountable. I finished my wine and went inside, locking the door behind me. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to ensure the law was applied fairly and justice was served. But tonight, I was just Steve, a guy in a townhouse in Denver who'd stood up to a corrupt HOA and won. It was enough. The following months settled into a comfortable routine. The new HOA board proved to be competent and transparent, actually reducing fees after eliminating wasteful spending and bogus revenue schemes. Property values in Meadowbrook Hills stabilized, and even increased slightly, as word spread that the community had cleaned house and implemented strong oversight. I continued my work at the courthouse, handling everything from civil disputes to criminal cases, always aware now of how small abuses of power could spiral into larger problems if left unchecked. Every time a business permit crossed my desk, I thought about mile-high towing and made sure to give each application the thorough review it deserved. Tom Brennan and I still played golf every other weekend. On one particularly nice Saturday morning, about 18 months after the whole incident, we were on the back nine when he brought it up. "You know, the Morrison case became a teaching example at the DA's office," he said, lining up his putt. "How so?" "We use it to train new prosecutors on fraud cases. It's a perfect example of how systematic documentation and following the paper trail can build an overwhelming case. Morrison and Hutchins documented everything themselves. They basically built their own prosecution." "People always think they're smarter than they are," I said. "True. But it's also a good example of how one person paying attention can make a difference. If you just paid the fees and moved on, they'd probably still be running their scheme. Someone would have noticed eventually. Maybe. Or maybe not. A lot of people don't read HOA minutes or review financial statements. They pay their dues, follow the rules, and assume leadership is acting in good faith." He had a point. How many HOAs across the country were running similar schemes? Small-scale fraud that flew under the radar because no one was paying close attention. How many people paid bogus fees because it was easier than fighting back? "I got lucky," I said. "I had the knowledge and resources to push back." "Most people don't, which is why it matters that you did." We finished our round and grabbed lunch at the clubhouse. Tom's phone buzzed with a work email and he glanced at it with a frown. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah, just another HOA complaint. Different community, similar issues. Guy's claiming his HOA is charging excessive landscaping fees and contracting with a company owned by a board member's relative. Here we go again." "It never ends," Tom said. "But at least now we have precedent and a framework for how to investigate these cases. Your situation showed us what to look for." I drove home that afternoon thinking about patterns and precedents, about how one case could influence dozens of others, about the ripple effects of standing up for what's right. My situation had been resolved, but it had also opened eyes to a broader problem. The Meadowbrook Hills community continued to thrive. New families moved in, attracted by the transparent governance and strong community involvement. The playground equipment was updated, the common areas were beautifully maintained, and the monthly meetings actually meant something now. I ran into Linda Carmichael, the treasurer who'd stayed on after Brenda and Gary's resignation, at the grocery store one day. "Judge Ashford, how are you?" She said warmly. "Please call me Steve. I'm doing well. How's the HOA?" "Running smoothly, thank goodness. We just finished our annual audit. Clean bill of health, no irregularities. It's amazing how much easier everything is when you're just honest about the money." "Imagine that," I said with a smile. "I wanted to tell you, we're establishing a community service award in your name. The Steven Ashford Award for Civic Responsibility. We'll give it annually to a resident who exemplifies community involvement and accountability." "That's not necessary," I said, genuinely uncomfortable with the idea. "Maybe not necessary, but deserved. What you did changed this community for the better. Let us honor that." I didn't have a good argument against it, so I accepted graciously. The award was presented for the first time at the annual community barbecue that summer. I gave a brief speech about the importance of civic engagement, about reading the fine print, about asking questions and demanding transparency from leadership. "None of us want to be the person who makes waves," I said to the crowd gathered in the common area. "It's easier to pay the fees, follow the rules, assume everything is being handled properly. But communities only work when people participate, when they pay attention, when they're willing to stand up and say something when things don't seem right." There was applause, and then we all went back to eating burgers and watching kids run through the sprinklers. Normal, ordinary community life. That evening, sitting on my porch with a beer, I reflected on the strange journey that had started with a missing truck on a snowy morning. I'd been angry, frustrated, ready to fight over what seemed like a simple injustice. I hadn't expected to uncover fraud. I hadn't expected criminal charges and resignations and community transformation. But that's how these things work sometimes. You pull one thread and the whole tapestry unravels. You ask one question and suddenly you're asking a dozen more. You stand up for yourself and end up standing up for everyone. My phone rang. It was Maria from the courthouse. "Sorry to bother you on a Saturday evening, Judge, but there's something I thought you should know about Monday's docket." "What's up?" "There's a case involving an HOA in Aurora. Residents are suing for fraudulent fees and unauthorized contracts. The HOA's lawyer filed a motion to dismiss, citing lack of standing. I remembered the Morrison case and thought you'd want to review it personally. Send me the files. I'll take a look tonight." I spent the next hour reviewing the case documents. It was eerily similar to what had happened at Meadowbrook Hills. An HOA board contracting with companies owned by relatives, collecting kickbacks, charging excessive fees for questionable services. The residents had organized and filed suit, but the HOA was fighting back hard, using technical legal arguments to try to get the case dismissed. On Monday morning, I sat in my courtroom and heard arguments from both sides. The HOA's lawyer was smooth and confident, arguing that the residents had agreed to all fees by virtue of their covenant agreements, that the board had acted within its authority, that this was simply a case of buyer's remorse. The resident's lawyer, younger and less polished, argued that the fees were fraudulent, that the contracts were self-dealing, that the HOA had violated its fiduciary duty to the residents. I let both sides present their arguments fully, asked pointed questions about the documentation and the timeline, and then took the matter under advisement. That afternoon, I issued my ruling. The case would proceed to trial. The residents had presented sufficient evidence of potential fraud to warrant a full hearing. In my written opinion, I cited the Morrison case as precedent, noting that HOA boards have significant authority but also significant responsibility, and that authority exercised for personal gain rather than community benefit is not protected by covenant agreements or corporate structure. The ruling made local news. Judge cites own HOA case in Aurora fraud ruling, the headline read. I got calls from reporters wanting interviews, but I declined. The rulings spoke for themselves. Over the next year, I presided over 3 more cases involving HOA fraud or abuse of authority. Each time, I made sure to apply the law fairly, to give both sides a full hearing, to base my decisions on evidence rather than personal experience. But I also made sure to send a clear message. HOAs serve communities, not the other way around, and anyone who abuses that trust will face consequences. The Aurora case eventually settled out of court, with the HOA agreeing to full restitution, resignation of the board members involved, and implementation of new oversight procedures. 2 of the other cases went to trial, resulting in judgments for the residents. The 3rd case was dismissed when the HOA voluntarily reversed the fees in question and apologized. I like to think that word spread through the HOA community, that board members across Denver and the surrounding areas realized they were being watched more closely, held to higher standards. Whether that's true or just wishful thinking, I don't know. But the number of HOA fraud cases crossing my desk did decrease over time. My life returned to its normal rhythm. Work at the courthouse, quiet evenings at home, occasional social events with neighbors who'd become friends through shared experience. The story of my truck being towed became something people mentioned occasionally, usually with a laugh, a reminder of how things had changed for the better. 2 years after that blizzard morning, I got a call from a producer at a local news station. They were doing a series on HOA reform and wanted to interview me as someone who'd experienced HOA fraud firsthand and then helped change the system. I almost declined. I didn't want to be known as the anti-HOA judge, didn't want every case that came to my courtroom to be viewed through that lens. But then, I thought about all the people who didn't have the knowledge or resources to fight back, who paid bogus fees because they didn't know what else to do. I agreed to the interview. It aired on a Thursday evening. I watched it from my living room, feeling strange seeing myself on television talking about Meadowbrook Hills, about Brenda and Gary, about the importance of HOA accountability. The producer had done a good job, balancing my story with interviews from other residents and legal experts discussing HOA reform. The response was overwhelming. My clerk fielded dozens of calls the next day from people wanting legal advice about their HOAs. I had to issue a statement clarifying that I couldn't provide individual legal counsel, but encouraging people to document everything, read their covenants carefully, and seek professional help if they suspected fraud. The Colorado State Legislature took notice. A bill was introduced requiring HOAs to submit detailed financial reports to the county, undergo regular independent audits, and provide clear notice before taking any enforcement action. The bill cited the Morrison case and several others as examples of why reform was needed. I testified before the State Senate committee reviewing the bill, speaking not as a judge but as a resident who'd experienced HOA abuse. The bill passed with bipartisan support and was signed into law 6 months later. Standing in the state capitol building watching the governor sign the HOA Reform Act, I felt a sense of completion. What had started as a personal frustration on a snowy morning had led to systemic change. Thousands of Colorado residents would now have better protections against the kind of abuse I'd experienced. Tom Brennan found me after the signing ceremony. "Hell of a journey from a towed truck to state legislation," he said. "Not the journey I expected to take," I admitted. "The best ones never are." I drove back to Meadowbrook Hills that evening, parked my truck in the same spot it had been towed from 2 years earlier, and looked around at the community that had become more than just a place I lived. It was proof that systems could change, that standing up mattered, that one person's willingness to fight back could create ripples that reached farther than anyone imagined. The next morning, I woke up to my alarm at 6 a.m., just like always. I got ready for work, made coffee, checked my email. There was a message from the courthouse with the day's docket. Cases to hear, decisions to make, justice to serve. As I backed my truck out of the driveway, I noticed a new family moving into the townhouse across the street. A young couple with a small child, unloading boxes from a rental truck. I waved, and they waved back. They were new to Meadowbrook Hills, new to HOA living. They had no idea about the scandal that had transformed this community, about the fight that had led to state legislation, about the morning 2 years ago when a judge woke up to find his truck missing. And that was fine. They'd live in a community with strong oversight, transparent governance, and leaders who understood they served at the pleasure of residents. They'd benefit from reforms they didn't know existed, protections put in place by people they'd never meet. That's how progress works. Not with grand gestures or dramatic moments, but with quiet changes that make life a little bit better, a little bit fairer, for everyone who comes after. I drove to the courthouse, ready for whatever the day would bring, knowing that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never plan to fight, and sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that help people you'll never know. The streets were clear, the morning was bright, and my truck was exactly where it was supposed to be. Everything else was just details.